Hi everyone, and welcome to the Forensic Evidence Packaging Techniques lecture. So I want to spend some time highlighting proper packaging procedures. The goal of evidence packaging is to preserve the evidence from both human and natural damage. This means protecting against evidence loss, like when small pieces of evidence fall out of the packaging, or if tiny pieces of evidence are overlooked when the package is opened and the evidence is removed. It also includes preservation of evidence within the package itself, meaning that there's no contamination between different pieces of evidence or different items within the package. The package should also make it easier for investigators to identify when there has been any tampering or accidental damage to the package, so as to protect against purposeful tampering or contamination. Investigators must therefore carefully consider what packaging will best accomplish this goal by taking the individual type of evidence into consideration. The choice of packaging container itself is an important factor in helping to reduce evidence loss. The investigator needs to carefully consider the size of the object and the package to make sure they're matched appropriately. If the container is too small for the evidence, then the package can be damaged over time. On the other hand, if the container is too big, then the evidence will move around a lot inside the packaging, and this may make it difficult to recover or even potentially create damage on the evidence. Consider the evidence in the top photograph on this slide. The evidence barely fits into the bag. The evidence itself may have gotten damaged by shoving it into that small packaging, and even if it remains undamaged, there are several gaps and areas of strain that could easily rip and allow the evidence to fall out of the package. So when determining the appropriate packaging container, you should also consider leaking potential. Small items that can fall out of small cracks should be packaged in smaller boxes or bags so they don't get lost. Notice in the bottom photograph how the package only has a tiny opening in it, but it's still enough to allow that little piece of glass to escape. So you're going to lose some actual evidence. And finally, the investigator should also consider the material itself. Are there evaporation concerns? If the evidence will require some sort of fume analysis, then the investigator should consider using airtight containers like paint cans to prevent loss. Similarly, sharp items can tear through packaging and fall out, so sharp items should not be packaged in paper packages. Instead, they're usually contained in specially marked plastic tubes or boxes, and I'll show you an example of this further on in the lecture. Now on the package itself, you should document the items listed here. And this is not a final list of things to document because different agencies may have specific evidence packaging label requirements, but this is a good list for generic. Essentially, you want to ensure that the package is identifiable using a unique number, letter, or combination of numbers and letters. You also want to make sure that the time, the date, and the location of collection are noted, and that a description of the item contained within the package is included. That way, in case of loss or tampering, you know what was supposed to be contained within the evidence package. Packages should also contain the information of the crime scene investigator who collected the evidence and who created the package. Depending on the agency, this may be in the form of the investigator initials, it may be a badge number, it could be the investigator's full name, it could be a combination thereof. Now, some evidence bags come pre-printed with places for this information. Others contain a chain of custody area as well, so officers can do everything on the package itself. Pre-printed packaging is more expensive though, so some agencies may have investigators write directly onto the package freehand, or they may provide their own pre-printed labels that can be attached to the evidence packaging. Notice that in the picture on the left, the self-printed evidence label is located below the clear tape that's used to seal the package. This would help make sure that the evidence label cannot be tampered with without visible signs. Now, sealing is important for evidence packaging, as the seal is what ensures that the evidence remains free from tampering and other loss after collection. There's a special type of evidence tape used for sealing called tamper-proof evidence tape. Tamper-proof evidence tape is purposefully thin and fragile, which it helps ensure that future contamination or alteration of the evidence is easily visible. Now, just to be clear, it is thin and fragile, meaning it's kind of a pain in the butt to work with. And so for that reason, you can also use regular clear tape, as long as you use it in such a way that any tampering is easily visible. And that's going to depend on what your agency protocols are too as well. As part of the seal on the package, whether it's tamper-proof tape or whether it's just clear tape, investigators should include a personal identifier, and that's either a signature or a badge number, and also the date that the package was sealed. This information should be written so that it's halfway on the tape seal and halfway off. That way, if the seal is broken, the identifiers don't match up, and it's going to be clear that the package was tampered with. Here's a step-by-step process showing you how to properly seal an envelope. In order to prevent loss from open corners, the best thing to do is tape it in such a way that the taped seal fully encompasses all open areas. This way there cannot be any accidental loss of evidence. Also recommended, and shown in this photo series, is sealing the package with only one single piece of tape. Again, this helps ensure that future tampering of the evidence seal is more easily visible. It is recommended as much as possible to avoid putting multiple layers on top of each other, because the multiple layers of tape can make tampering less evident. Also note here, this recommendation against double layering includes the tamper-proof evidence tape. So if you decide to seal the package with clear tape, put your signature and the date directly on the clear tape rather than covering the clear tape with evidence tape and then providing your information. Here are just some more examples describing how to properly seal packages. When packaging evidence, you want to seal it tightly. The seal should be designed in such a way that it makes tampering impossible to do unnoticed. Don't use staples or put the seal perpendicular to the bag. Always seal the entire flap so that nothing can escape. You can see the investigator's signature on halfway on the tape and halfway on the envelope on the properly sealed package on the right. Oh, and there you go. There's my smiley faces. Remember that when you package evidence, you should also start a chain of custody. The chain of custody is a document that can show who was in possession of the evidence from the time it was collected at the scene to the time that it was submitted in court. Most agencies will use one of two ways to document custody. They can either write the chain of custody on the evidence packaging directly, usually in the form of a label or a pre-printed area on the package, or they use a supplemental form or system in which they document each person who gains custody of the evidence at various points in time. And your book talks about the barcode system. It's that same concept of the written form of chain of custody, just in a numerical electronic way. Of importance here is a discussion about the sealing and releasing of evidence. In many cases, the crime scene investigator will collect evidence of the scene and submit the evidence in the same packaging to the crime laboratory for analysis. In other cases, though, the investigator may process the evidence themselves in some way at a location other than the crime lab. In this case, the officer will need to collect the evidence in temporary packaging, transport the evidence somewhere, and then process the evidence and repackage. For example, one of the preservation concerns for evidence is mold and bacteria. If you collect evidence that's wet, like a t-shirt covered in blood, you need to air dry the evidence before putting it into a final evidence package. First, the investigator should collect the wet evidence in a paper bag. Never use plastic bags for wet evidence because this encourages the growth of bacteria and mold. The investigator should seal the package as normal and take the package back to the crime laboratory. There, the analyst will unpackage the evidence and let the evidence dry out before repackaging the evidence again. To show that proper procedures were used at all times to protect the new evidence, the analyst should include the dried temporary packaging inside of the new package. Another situation that analysts will encounter is the need to reopen a sealed package. This is usually done by laboratory analysts who must open the evidence packaging to test the evidence for substances like trace analysis, DNA evidence, etc. Whenever you reopen a package, you should do so in a manner that makes it clear you have reopened it. That means that you should avoid the original seal and you should open the package in a new location, like the side of the package or the bottom of the package. Once you're done with the evidence, repackage it in the same container by sealing the new opening in the same manner as the original. If the evidence is analyzed by multiple people, you should see multiple seals present on the packaging, all signed and dated by each individual investigator. All right, now let's discuss the next concern about preserving evidence, which is to avoid contamination. There are three main types of contamination concerns. When we talk about contamination of items, we usually think of item-to-item cross-contamination, meaning that trace from one piece of evidence is transferred to another. You can avoid this by using multiple containers, with one piece of evidence per container. Remember, the rule of thumb is that if it wasn't touching at the crime scene, it shouldn't be touching in the packaging. You can also prevent item-to-item contamination by cleaning equipment and gloves between evidence. A lot of instruments are now disposable, like swabs and tweezers. One-time use prevents cross-contamination between items. So after you use those gloves and that tweezer to pick up some trace evidence, get rid of the glove, get rid of the tweezers, get a new pair of gloves, a new pair of tweezers, and then go pick up your second batch of trace evidence. Now, depending on the type of analysis being conducted, we may also be concerned with within-item cross-contamination, meaning that trace from one area of the evidence is transferred to another area. For example, we would not be worried about hair evidence transferring from the front of the t-shirt to the back, but we would be worried about gunshot residue transferring from the front to the back of the shirt, because the location of the residue is utmost important in the analysis. That's why shirts and other clothing items are usually laid out between two pieces of butcher paper or wax paper. This provides a protective layer that stops transfer from different parts of the t-shirt as the t-shirt is folded. Think of it like cheese packaging. Even though the pieces are sealed together in the same package, the wax paper between each piece stops the pieces from touching one another directly. And that's what the butcher paper can do for shirts and other objects that you're going to fold onto itself. Lastly, we should also do our best to prevent investigator contamination of items. Double glove at the scene so that you can change gloves between pieces of evidence without exposing your hands to the scene itself. Also, avoid touching your body during evidence collection as much as possible. Remember that we use increasingly sensitive DNA analyses, so it's important that investigators try to limit their own DNA transfer as much as possible. Keep your hair tied back and wear protective clothing, as that's going to help reduce investigator transfer at the scene as well. Lastly, something to consider when thinking about contamination is the state of the evidence. It's important to remember that wet evidence should be treated differently than dry evidence. I've said this already, but it's so important, I'm going to say it again. Never use plastic containers with wet evidence. Package in paper and then put in a drying case before using a final package. Most labs will have a drying case that is specifically designed to dry items using venting and low humidity. Depending on agency protocol, one drying case may be used for one case at a time, or it may be used for multiple cases and different pieces of evidence in there. Drying cases are usually located in a secured area with restricted access so that chain of custody remains intact after while the drying takes place. All right, well, that completes the evidence packaging lecture. Thanks for watching.